Something felt wrong from the beginning. The back door was open again. Not wide open, just cracked, maybe 2 inches, enough to let the cold air pool around my ankles. I know I locked it. I know because I always lock it. I checked it twice before. I went to bed, so why was it open? I stood in the kitchen doorway in my socks, staring at that thin strip of black night showing through the gap, and I didn't move toward it. I didn't call out. Something in the back of my brain told me to be very, very still. My name is Daniel. I'm 29 years old, and I live alone in a 2-bedroom house on Mercer Street. I've lived there for almost 3 years. I know every sound that house makes, the way the pipes groan after a hot shower, the specific creak on the 4th stair, the way the kitchen window rattles when wind comes from the north. I know this house the way you know something you've spent a long time not being afraid of. That morning was when things started to shift. I closed the back door, locked it, and told myself the latch must have slipped. Old house, old hardware. It happens. I made coffee, got dressed, went to work, and by the time I came home that evening I had mostly convinced myself it was nothing. Mostly, the first thing I noticed when I walked in was that the chair at my kitchen table had been moved. Now listen, I know how that sounds. A chair. Big deal. But this particular chair, the one I always pull out to sit down, I always push it back in at an angle, slightly to the left. It's just a habit. That chair was pushed straight in, perfectly. Centered under the table. Neat. Deliberate. I hadn't done that. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listened. The house was quiet. I checked the rooms, quickly, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Everything looked normal. Nothing was missing. I even went back to the kitchen and moved the chair to its usual angle. Like that would fix something. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day I noticed something else. I have this shelf in the hallway where I keep my keys and a small stack of books I've been meaning to read. The books were in a different order. I know the order because the top one was a red hardcover, and it always sat on top. Now it was on the bottom. Someone had taken the books off the shelf, one by one, and put them back in a different sequence. Or I'd done it and forgotten. I told myself that. I almost believed it, but then I found the photos. I have a cork board in my office, the 2nd bedroom. I use as a workspace. I pin things to it, receipts, notes, a few photos from a camping trip I took with my college friends about 2 years ago. Nothing special, just a habit I have of keeping things visible. One of those photos had been taken down from the board and placed face down on my desk. I picked it up and flipped it over. It was a picture of me sitting by a fire at the campsite. My friends were behind me. I was looking directly at the camera. I was smiling. Someone had placed that photo face down on my desk. I called my friend Marcus that night. He's the kind of person who thinks carefully before he speaks, which is why I called him instead of someone else. I told him everything. The door, the chair, the books, the photo. I listed it all out, and as I did it, I realized how absurd it sounded. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Have you checked whether all your windows lock properly?" I had not. I went through every window in the house that night with a flashlight. Ground floor, front window, fine. Bathroom window, fine. The window in the 2nd bedroom, my office, it wasn't latched. The little metal latch that holds it shut had been rotated upward. Unlocked. I stood at that window and looked out. Into the side yard. My neighbor's fence. A strip of grass. Nothing out of the ordinary. I latched it, pressed it hard to make sure it held, and went to bed. I set up my laptop to record that night. I positioned it on the dresser facing the bedroom. Door started a screen recording and left it running. It was a stupid, clumsy thing to do. Not a proper camera, but it was something. When I checked the footage in the morning, nothing was there. Just me, sleeping. Just the dark room. I felt foolish, honestly. Relieved and foolish. And then I checked the timestamp. There was a gap in the recording. Not a huge gap, but a gap 11 minutes, starting at 2:43 in the morning. The recording just cut out and came back. My laptop hadn't gone to sleep, hadn't crashed. There was no error. The screen recorder simply stopped, and then started again 11 minutes later. 11 minutes is a long time. I called in sick to work. I sat at my kitchen table and thought carefully about what I was dealing with. Either I was losing my mind, which was possible but felt wrong, or someone was getting into my house. Someone who was careful. Someone who wasn't taking anything or breaking anything, just moving things, just touching things. The thought that scared me most wasn't the idea of a stranger in my house. The thought that scared me most was the reason. If you break into someone's house to steal, that makes sense in a terrible way. But this rearranging books, moving a chair an inch, flipping a photo over, this wasn't about taking anything from me. This was about letting me know they'd been there. I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed that afternoon. New deadbolts, new latch on the back door, new hardware on every exterior door. It cost me more than I expected, and I didn't care at all. The locksmith was a quiet older man who worked quickly and didn't ask questions, and when he left, I felt safer for about 2 hours. Then I noticed the closet. I have a coat closet next to the front door. I opened it to hang up my jacket that evening, and something stopped me before I even registered what was wrong. The smell. It wasn't a bad smell exactly, but it was wrong, slightly chemical, like a deodorant or a soap I don't use. A person's scent. Faint, but real. Someone had been in that closet. Hi. Backed up and stood in the middle of my living room, and every hair on my arms was standing up. I looked at my front door, newly locked. I looked at the back door, newly locked. The windows were all latched. I'd checked them again that morning, and yet the smell was there. How long had that smell been there? Had I just not noticed before? I started thinking back, trying to remember whether I'd been in that closet recently. When had I last opened it? And then something else came back to me, something I'd completely ignored at the time. About 2 weeks ago, before any of this started. I came home from work, and my coat, my long gray wool coat that I'd left hanging in that closet was on the floor. I'd assumed the hanger had slipped. I'd picked it up, hung it back, and thought nothing of it. 2 weeks ago, whatever this was, it hadn't started with the back door. It had already been happening, and I hadn't noticed that. I called Marcus again. I told him about the smell. He told me to call the police, which I should have done days earlier. I don't know exactly why I hadn't. I think part of me was afraid of saying out loud that someone was inside my house, because it would make it real. The police came, 2 officers, and they were professional and thorough. They checked the house, found nothing, and took my report. Seriously, even though I could see in their faces that they didn't have much to work with. No forced entry, no witnesses, no clear evidence of anything criminal, just a man who felt like something was wrong. They suggested I consider a camera system. They said they'd do periodic drive-bys of the block. One of them gave me her card. That night I slept with the light on. I put a chair under the handle of my bedroom door. I lay there in the orange glow listening to my house, and I kept thinking about the closet, about the gap in the recording, about 11 minutes of nothing. The next morning, the chair under my bedroom door was on its side. I hadn't knocked it over. I would have heard that. I would have felt it. I was awake half the night. The chair was upright when I finally fell asleep somewhere around 4 in the morning, and when I opened my eyes at 7, it was on its side. Quietly toppled, not fallen, like it had been gently laid down on the floor. My hands were shaking when I called the police again. This time they sent different officers, and one of them, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, went into my basement. I hadn't been in my basement in at least a week. I use it for storage, boxers from when I moved in. Nothing important. There's a small utility area, and then a bigger open space, stacked with cardboard. The officer came upstairs after about 5 minutes, and he looked at me differently than he had before. He said I should come take a look. I followed him down in the far corner, behind a stack of boxers. There was a space. The boxers had been arranged around it, almost like a kind of nest. There was a folded blanket on the floor, a water bottle, a phone charger with the USB end snapped off, lying coiled. Beside it, a plastic grocery bag. The officer was already on his radio. Someone had been living in my basement. I stood and looked at that space, and I felt something that I can't fully describe. It wasn't just fear. It was a rewriting. Every single moment from the past few weeks played through my mind in a single second, and every detail shifted meaning all at once. The open door, the moved chair, the books, the photo placed face down on my desk. That photo? Someone who had been in my house for weeks, who had watched me, who had had access to every room, every drawer, every private corner of my life. That person had chosen to go into my office and turn one photograph, face dash down, the one of me, looking at the camera. I never went back to that house. I stayed with Marcus for 2 weeks while the investigation continued. They found evidence that the person had been there for almost a month of nights, a month of me sleeping in my bed while something breathed quietly 2 floors below, a month of small, careful adjustments designed not to be noticed, or maybe designed to be noticed just enough to make me feel like I was imagining things. They never told me exactly what the person wanted. Maybe there was no single answer to that question. Maybe some people do what they do for reasons that don't fit into the clean explanations we need. What I know is this. I think about that first morning. The back door cracked open. The cold air around my ankles. The feeling that made me go completely still. I think my body understood something before I did, and I think if I had listened to it sooner, if I had called for help that first morning instead of making coffee and going to work those 11 minutes might mean something different to me now. Instead, they mean exactly what they mean. 11 minutes of a man sleeping and something else being very, very quiet in the dark.